Peter, you and I are the workers right now, and people that are listening, we are the workers. If we are committed to doing good work, like I know you are, and like how I am, and how I imagine most people listening to this podcast are, we are the ones that the Marxist theory will have to attack because we're the ones doing work. This isn't a moment where you can hide your head in the sand and let theories that, well, don't seem to really attack you take power in your workplace or take power in your local political section, because eventually they will come for you. Just like these Bolshevik ideas came for everyone in Russia. Welcome back to the Pinedo Brothers Podcast. I'm JP.
And I'm Peter.
We're glad that you're back with us. We are the Pinedo Brothers, filmmaking brothers working to revitalize the world of Catholic art. Our next project is live now, Project X. We think of it as the next generation of storytelling, a sort of NFT-based filmmaking experience. Today we're talking about Bolsheviks and how that sort of pattern of the Bolsheviks taking over Russia is repeating itself here in the United States. I don't think that many people are going to watch this. I think that this is going to be a pretty well stifled podcast. So how's that?
Censored?
If you're watching this, we're glad that you are. And I don't think there'll be many of you. But in any case, let's try and put on a good show, shall we, Pete?
Mm-hmm. I liked the way that you introed that for talking about, because you were like so excited. Today we're going to talk about Bolsheviks, because I think that's how like Russia was, because like we'll get into it in just a second, but like with the Tsar, everyone's like, it was just really hard times. So people are excited for something new. And what did they get? Bolsheviks. Nothing good.
Whoops. Oh no. Well, let's set the stage. World War I is raging. We those of you that have listened to the first podcast, you know that we set the stage for this already there. But just to recap real quickly, World War I is raging. It's 1917. Russia has left the war early, while the rest of the world continues to fight because they're no longer really stable enough to continue. Tsarist Russia has shown itself to be completely incapable of really accomplishing anything. Does that sound about accurate, Pete?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. And beyond not being capable of doing anything, there's unrest among many of the industrialized areas where people are just working around the clock to try to fuel the war machine. People are going on strike. It's a messy time. And so Russia bows out, and it gets so bad that the Tsar, Alexander, decides that he needs to abdicate. And when he does that, things just get worse. It gets a lot worse. Because enter Lenin at that point, who grew up in Russia and had fled that country to go and learn more about Marxism in other parts of Europe. But before we really introduce Lenin, let's talk a little bit about the kind of undercurrent which he is going to arrive into. There is a lot of unrest. There's a lot of people that are not happy with their situation. Alexander could be said to have been he was not the harshest of czars, which probably was his downfall. He was right in the middle. He was not what you would call a reformer, where he's trying to give people more rights. He's also not a dictator, where he's just brutally cracking down on people. The right in the middle was just the perfect amount to help him lose his head, quite literally, because he's not pleasing anybody. He's not pleasing the people that want the peasants and the people sowing unrest to be brutally shut down, and he's not pleasing the people that want more rights at all. And it's not it's a lot of different people that are unhappy right now. I think the three classes that I would like to define or just paint a portrait of, are the peasants, the workers, and the students. How about that? The peasants, workers, and students. The peasants I would qualify as or quantify as a sort of the largest section, the largest of this group, because Russia is still largely agricultural, and they're the people that work the ground. Now, the peasants doesn't necessarily mean that they're poor, but the people that are most unhappy are probably the poorer ones. But as a rule, the peasant life is not afforded the kind of rights that the rest of the countries in Europe are afforded, and that's not a great mixture for this group. Then there is the workers. There are parts of Russia, especially Petersburg, St. Petersburg, that are industrialized, and they're the ones that have most of the output for the war machine. The workers are not happy at this point because, like I said, they're working across the clock, around the clock, to feed this war machine, and they don't have the resources to actually do it properly, and so they're always under the 8 ball. And Russia is not good at industrialization, period. So these guys are not. The situation for them is not good. The living situation is bad. At the same time, they're not the allies of the students, so to speak. And we'll see how that is brought to light quite a bit. The students are really the elitist of this group. The students are the ones that probably have never had to till the ground, at least not much, if they have. They've had enough money, so they come from money enough to go to universities. Probably around Europe, they've been to universities. And here at these universities, they are coming into contact with what was very in fashion at this time, Marxist ideals, Marxist teaching. Karl Marx, the founder of communism, is really kind of the darling of the university system in Europe at this time. And I think you might be able to see that now in our current universities. What would you say to that, though, Pete?
Well, I think that you see a very similar thing as far as like students taking far left positions in college, and then assuming that makes them represent the lower class or the proletariat, which I think is definitely not true, because like if you're in college, obviously you're coming from a certain amount of privilege, I would say. Granted, like lots of people are just there because of loans, but I think that the large bulk of the people that you see in college today, who are like the most radical leftists, like most like fire and brimstone, kind of screaming in your face, are people who come from like pretty well-to-do middle class families. And now they're espousing like these radical Marxist ideas. But like you really like see it, especially at like any private schools that are like wildly leftist, and you see people like screaming. It's pretty like funny. It's like, yeah, I mean, you come from a lot more than I had, and you're like screaming these ideas. Especially if you have like your parents here paying for you to be in school so that you can become a Marxist. But I think that looking back through history, universities it's kind of been a trend that universities become the place where Marxist ideas really spread. And
why do you think that is? That's an interesting.
Yeah, I think to me it kind of makes a little bit of sense, because what is, like you think about what is Marxism, and Marxism really is social Darwinism, and the idea that it's that society has always been and will always be survival of the fittest, basically. And so the idea that the lower classes are always being oppressed by the upper classes And so in order for, to balance out that social Darwinism idea, they need to rise up and take the power from the upper class. So it's just a constant struggle between the lower and upper classes. To me, that's what Marxism is. And so from a certain point of view, I think it really makes sense that universities would be the place that spread, because it does seem like a very enlightened idea. And on a certain degree, it really makes a lot of sense, I think, because in theory, Marxism doesn't really sound that bad, I would say. Who doesn't want a society with equality and everyone Marxism paints a picture of a utopia. But that's the thing, that utopia is not achievable on Earth.
And I think, piggybacking off that idea, there's an odd superpower that the university system has. And I'll explain that superpower by telling a story. When I was in college, I spent a semester in Spain at the University of Navarre, and there I met one of my good buddies. Shout out to Craig Ifland, who's now teaching philosophy at Notre Dame, and we had many very fascinating conversations to me there, mostly about movies. We're talking about the philosophy that underpins movies, but Craig would always come back to he would always come back to, at the end of all these philosophical jaunts that we'd be talking about, he would come back to, well, I need to just till the ground. I need to go out and I want to be a farmer for a couple of years. And I would be like, Craig, why? You clearly have, he was already writing in philosophy journals, and he clearly had an aptitude for his chosen profession. And he said, well, I need to be able to get some sort of understanding of things that's beyond what I can think. I need to be able to have an experiential understanding of how the world works from just a very basic level, where I know that I'm not completely off base with what I'm thinking, because I've actually experienced the world outside of just thinking. And I think what you'll see in a lot of these universities is that there isn't that check on reality, where you're like, okay, well, does this actually work? Does this theory that we're out there spinning have any basis in reality? Because the university system should be a place where you're just thinking. You're just thinking, and you're like, okay, how far can we go with this theory? What can we come up with? And that's not a bad thing. However, if you take that concept in the university system and it's bred only in that sort of ivory tower, then when you try to apply it outside of the world, and you're like, well, I know this works because I thought it out. In the outside world, outside of the university system, that sort of incubator, you're trying to apply it and it's not working, it's having disastrous effects. Well, then maybe you should go back and blame your concept, blame your theory, and say, let's try and rework this, because obviously in reality, this has some issues. And that's never what's been done with social Darwinism or Marxism. It's always been, well, let's blame reality. Reality isn't working. Let's make let's fix reality and to fit the concept, which was construed completely outside of reality. That superpower to be able to spin ideas and come up with concepts and theories is a great one, but it's also a terrible one. It's deadly if you don't ever try to, go out and apply it by working on a farm for a little bit and see how far your theories take you. Because we're going to see this sort of milieu that we have, that creates a movement, can kill many, many people, millions, tens of millions of people, if it's not ever checked by reality. It's sort of philosophy unbridled. Plato might be angry at me for that statement, but well, anyway, that's the kind of undercurrent that's going on. Is there is students that are saying, they're looking at their world and they're saying that this doesn't work. like this is not right. These are not rights, and that should be, people should be have more power to say and do what they in their daily life. And that's a good point. However, at the same time, they're also proponents of Marxism, which, like you said, is the might makes right, and so the lower class is always going to be preyed upon by the upper class. Therefore, the lower class must overthrow. It must become the upper class. And that's what they're able to do, as we're going to see. They're able to become the ones that prey upon everyone else. So maybe we can give a little bit of a portrait of Lenin at this point. Lenin is going to enter this battleground and really make some splashes. He grew up in Russia. He was just like the most people within that student uprising. Comes from money. He wasn't a noble, but at the same time, they had a ton of money, and they were able to educate him in all the best schools in Russia. His father was a devout Russian Orthodox. His mother thought that there wasn't much there to Christianity. She was Christian in name only. When his father died, he was still young. He was a young teenager, which is interesting because I wonder what would have happened if his father had never died. I wonder if he had actually would have come back and decided that he should also, maybe there's something to his father's theories about Christianity. Because soon after his father died, he says, "I'm no longer Christian." And he really just goes all for it in his studies. And he does very well. Unfortunately, he allies himself, he finds Marxist theory in the universities. He gets, things get a little too hot for him with his kind of rebellious ideas. His brother is also a rebel. And so he flees to the rest of the country, to the rest of Europe, kind of jumps around London, Munich, different places like that. And he embroils himself with the Bolshevik movements, which are those that have really accepted Marxism to a radical degree. They call themselves the Bolsheviks. And they're all around Europe, and he really embroils himself within this network of Bolshevism. While Russia is going through all this unrest because of World War I, he sees that the czars no longer have the ability to rule and that they've abdicated, and he says, "This is the right time for me to go back. And the Bolsheviks, this is where I can organize the Bolshevik revolt there." And he goes back through war-torn Europe back to the motherland of Russia. It's interesting because Churchill knew because Churchill was working for he was very much, people know him from World War II, but like you pointed out, he was very much involved in World War I, and he knew about Lenin because he was very involved in geopolitical affairs, and he knew that when Lenin returned, that was a bad thing for Russia. He called Lenin the bacterium, which would infect all of Russia. And it's interesting because just like you see Putin doing homage really to Stalin right now, and kind of looking wistfully back to Stalin, the Stalinist times, you also saw that after Lenin died, people would look wistfully back to Lenin, making him sort of a saint during the oppression that Stalin was putting down. According to people that knew both of these, according to the firsthand accounts that knew both of these men, of the two, Lenin was far more brutal. He was far, far more evil in what he would do and kill, and people he would kill and throats he would slit in order to get his way. He was not. Let me see if we can show you a picture of this guy. That way,
you can get an idea.
Yeah, you get an idea of who we're talking about here.
Pretty easy guy. Yeah, there he is. Oh my gosh. The face only a mother could love.
The ability to do great evil is written in his face, it seems, which is interesting. I mean, I thought you might be able to. His face conveys more than what my words could convey in that regard. And so he grows to that. He goes back to this battleground, and there's another part that's rather interesting. And I'm looking at. I'm still have his picture up on my side, so I can see half his face, and it's quite terrifying. And it's perfect.
I'm watching you.
That's what it looks like, and it's perfect for explaining the another undercurrent that's going across a lot of these classes at this point, which Dostoevsky and Tolstoy speak about quite well, is this nihilistic tendency that's happening in Russia right now, where people start to lose any type of hope for the future. That things have always been bad and things always will be bad, and there's nothing really ever that's out there. The best thing we can do is blow things up. That's where the suicide bombers start, is during this period. And it's just the period right before now, but it's still going on. It's a real illness that's infecting a lot of different people. And interestingly enough, I think you see that now as well in our country right now. There's a sort of despair that's catching on. What do you think, Pete?
Yeah, I think you definitely see that despair today with lots of people. And I kind of see it as something that we've spoken to in the past about kind of the heresy of the modern age, where there's just this despair and this great sadness, where that comes from throwing off any kind of tie that we have to the past, like denying your identity, and then but not realizing that you then de facto take on a new identity that is like just toxic to you, and so I guess back then, I don't know, I'm not really sure. I think you definitely see it like in the writings like of the old Russian writers, the absolute like nihilistic despair, because those works are so depressing. They're always fun because they like have such redemptive value at the end, but it's really difficult to make it through because they're very depressing. So I think that gives you a good pulse of Russia at that time, at least the communities that these writers were living in.
And you see that in the writings. I just to personify that a little bit, Brothers Karamazov is one of my favorite books of all time. Yep. Well, I wonder.
It gives you an idea of his personality here. Brothers Karamazov is one of his favorites. We're dealing with a happy, optimistic fellow here.
Right. You my movies are going to have a lot of sadness in them. The two characters that I think really personify, I would say, the peasants and the students of this time are the brother, not Dmitri, not Aloysia, but the other one, I want to say Michael, but it's the Russian name for Michael, which is skipping my mind, or jumping out of my mind at the moment. He's the student that he's the well-educated one of the brothers, and he finds himself in just the grips of, he's not a bad man. He's an incredibly good man, a very heroic one. In a way, I mean, they're all heroic in a way. They're all good brothers, which is interesting. But he finds himself in the grips of complete and utter despair. And it's an educated one. He sees so much that's going on, and he says, there's no way we can get out of this. Mankind is rotten to the core. I'm rotten to the core. This is the end, And you see that now. You see that we're pretty well educated, right? Well, that's maybe not real educated. I would posit that the students going around Russia at that time were a lot more educated than we are, but we're educated enough to be dangerous. How about that? And
relative to history, I would say we're pretty educated, because if the majority of people can read, then I think we're doing pretty good. But
and reading is dangerous. So let's say we're educated enough to be dangerous, and that gives us an ability to know just enough to just confirm our fears that everyone is rotten. and that we're rotten, and that there's no way out of this. The other side of that nihilistic tendency that you would see is the father in the Brothers Karamazov, who is a peasant, a rich peasant. He's got a lot of money, but he's not a noble or anything like that. And he is rotten. He's not like the brother who's sort of a noble, sort of nihilistic person. He takes advantage of women, he murders, he kills, he is evil. He is bad. He's rotten to the core. He knows it. He knows he's rotten to the core, and he also thinks everyone else is just as bad as he is. And those type of people really take the lead at this time in Russia. It's not Tsarist Russia. It's not quite Bolshevik Russia yet, but those type of tendencies, those type of thoughts, that undercurrent of nihilism, people infected with that become the leaders of this time. And that's something we have to watch out for now, because we have that undercurrent of nihilism, that undercurrent of despair of the modern age that we've talked about, that you really bring to light quite well in your writings. But at the same time, they have not necessarily, people infected through and through with that type of thought, have not invaded our leadership quite yet. We'll know that we're in deep trouble when the people that lead us think nothing matters. And we'll see where we're headed, but we have to watch out for that. Really, this podcast is, look out, guys. We're seeing a pattern repeat itself, and we don't have real, we could talk about things we can do about it at the end, but this is really just a pattern check. So moving forward, Lenin makes it to Russia, and he takes charge of the Bolsheviks there that are working on this revolt. And he has a lot of success. The government's in chaos. There's not much that can be, there's really not that much to stand up to them. They're the one really formal and organized movement in this chaos of a country. And they have money, which is a big deal. Like, they have resources to be able to hire soldiers, hire people to go out and take charge of large swaths of the country. And that's what they do very effectively. There's really just one group that's able to stand up. The peasants are not able to stand up. The peasants get pretty brutally beaten up and killed, and so they take charge of that. But the one group the Tsarists are just completely in shambles. They can't really stand up to the Bolsheviks at this time. There's one group that's able to stand up to them, and they try to, which is so fascinating, because the Bolsheviks always call themselves the workers. They call themselves the movement of the workers. Well, it's the workers in St. Petersburg that fight against the Bolsheviks, the ones that actually say, well, no, this is not what we want. That destroys so much. That's something that people often forget in history is we have these lines, and we try to make history fit the lines, and the Bolsheviks tried to make, we're the workers' movement, fit. The workers fought against them. They had to march with their mercenary army. The Bolsheviks had to march on St. Petersburg. They attacked the city, and they killed the workers. That's how they took power, is by killing the workers. It's a fascinating bit of history that is being completely rewritten. And you're going to see that now with what's happening. These Marxist theories, Peter, you and I are the workers right now, and people that are listening, we are the workers. We're the ones, if we are committed to doing good work, like I know you are, and like how I am, and how I imagine most people listening to this podcast are, then we're the ones that the Marxist theory will have to attack, because we're the ones doing work. And it's a scary thought, because this isn't a moment where you can hide your head in the sand and let theories that don't seem to really attack you take power in your workplace, or take power in your local political section, because eventually they will come for you. Just like the Nazi ideas came for everyone, not just the Jews, everyone in Europe. These Bolshevik ideas came for everyone in Russia. So we have to be on the lookout for that. Thoughts on that, though?
Yeah, well, there's a whole bunch of thoughts. A lot of things really stand out to me. And I think that I guess the main thought I want to talk about that really, this idea of like being the worker, is very fascinating to me, because I think oftentimes in society today, like we don't know who we are, right? We don't know how to identify ourselves. Putting aside all the things about not knowing if you're a man or a woman, also just talking about where you fall, like in history, like what your identity is in that. It's a super fascinating idea of like embracing that role as a worker. And I think in Catholicism, you and I are Catholic, and is that has always been a very large part of Catholicism, is embracing your work.
Or at Labora.
Work and prayer. Work and prayer. Yeah. So really embracing that and sanctifying that. I think that a problem a lot of people have today, and something that causes a lot of despair, is that the idea of work is rejected as something that's oppressive to me. And which you totally get, like who doesn't want to be on vacation all the time? But you see, I think with some retired people that like if they don't have something to keep them going, like something to work towards and at, they're like their health will decline. Like you see it very, very often. But I think that could be really a solution to this kind of despair and this embracing this like Marxist idea, which we have seen multiple times throughout history is not working. The idea that you have to I think I've heard it expressed that like as a worker, you're being oppressed because you're working, for someone else's company, working for their glory and their profit. And it's just like it's putting you in this system that you don't want to be a part of. And I really think that there is a lot of freedom in realizing that you're not defined by your employment. And you're not defined by being like, you are more than your day job, right? So the fact that you are working for someone else's company, or that you're participating in this overarching system, I think there you can gain freedom by realizing like, yeah, this is not what defines me. And I think that also realizing that work is good, and that you're working towards building something for yourself and for your family, and contributing to society. So I think those are all really good things. And obviously in Russia, with a lot of despair there, like that wasn't realized. But I think with the peasants, that was realized in maybe not fully or consciously, but in a much fuller way, because they all had their families that they wanted to support, and they realized what was important, right?
Yeah,
and so they realized that this movement that's coming is not what we want. I'm sure part of that was because of just clinging on to, the old order, but I don't think that was all of it. I think that they realized that this was going to be harmful to them, because what was most important to them, more important than anything else, was supporting their family and protecting their family. And so when you realize threats to that, sacrificing yourself is really sacrificing yourself for that idea is understandable.
Yeah. And that dovetails really nicely into what the next part of this is, which is, probably the saddest part of the story. So Lenin, and he has a compatriot, Trotsky, at this time, but Trotsky doesn't really play in this story much, because it doesn't take long before Lenin just slits Trotsky's throat, and takes complete power over, this entire movement and rebellion. But we'll leave that. If you want to get a great analogy for that, I would say check out Animal Farm, because that does a really great job of telling this story from that sort of dual leadership perspective. So Lenin has complete control over the organized sections of Europe. He's got the workers. He's got what the parts that the czars really had, those kind of czarist strongholds. So he's got control of. But Russia is huge. It's got incredibly large sections of just farmland and peasants tilling the ground. And those peasants that you talked about are not completely sold, as you mentioned, on this Bolshevik rebellion. They maybe want a better life, but Bolshevism, that seems a little weird, that seems a little much. And so what does he do? He abolishes the police.
Really?
What do you think of that? What do you think of that? Like, talk about history repeating itself. And people don't realize, like, this is the first thing I think of when people talk about abolishing the police, like Black Lives Matter and all these things that became so popular these past few years. And even politicians talk about abolishing the police. People in Congress are talking about it. They're towing the Bolshevik line. This is the Bolshevik playbook. Abolish the police if you want to take control. It's terrifying to me. So he abolishes the police, and what he does is he hires convicts. He hires convicts as security people. And they go around the farmlands just killing whoever seems to step out of line, they're dead. And people stop stepping out of line. With police to sort of secure order, people were more secure to say, well, no, this is what I think and this is what I don't think. When there's no police and there's just a security team that wanders around, and there were the local security teams, then people are too scared because they're dying. These peasants are dying, and like you said, they're trying to look out for their families. So something that's happening right now, big time, whenever you hear someone talk about abolishing the police, think about the Bolsheviks. Think about how that's exactly what they did, because that's an incredibly scary thing. And it doesn't take long for them to take complete control of this huge country, this massive country. And they quickly change its name to a Soviet Union, because the Soviets is the word that they use for their sort of, it's a little bit more friendly than Bolshevism, at least on the global field, but it's still the Bolsheviks. And Russia is set for decades of death and despair. It's an incredibly sorrowful story. We don't have the time to go into full depths of how they managed to get really, really good at killing people. It's not just gangs of ruffians and thugs anymore, but it's just systematically. It's like, for example, burning the ground so that no one can grow crops so that millions die of starvation. It's that sort of idea that soon takes control of this land. So I don't want to make light of what we're seeing right now, because this sort of playbook leads to death. It probably you and I will die if this happens. If Bolsheviks, or the same people that use the Bolshevik type of playbook, take control of our country, you and I will probably die. And and
I would rather die than live under that kind of regime. Yeah. So
most of our listeners will die too, probably. This is a serious thing, and that doesn't mean you go out and start killing people. Obviously, I'm not preaching violence here, but I'm just saying things are being repeated that are scary to be seen. What do you make of all that?
You see many different indicators of going in a bad direction that you have seen nations go in the past. You see that today for sure. Like the idea of like kneeling instead of standing for the flag, right? Which is, it's very strange, because like I feel like kneeling is more respectful. But anyway, the idea is that they're disrespecting it. And on a certain degree, I get it, because like what a flag is a piece of material with things sewn together. So inherently, it doesn't really have any kind of value that's worthy of respect. But symbols are important, and what they could, because of what they represent. And so it's not that they're obviously like them people kneeling to disrespect the flag is not them disrespecting the materials, it's disrespecting the idea of what that flag represents. And I remember when that first started happening, like I think I was in college when it like blew up, became a big thing. I immediately, like, I texted someone and was like, yeah, this is the beginning of the end as far as the United States, because when you stop when you are like making those kinds of statements, or like that you are no longer respect the nation that you live in, that's not a good direction for the nation. You've seen it in the past, and it's always been, like I said, like the beginning of the end. As far as like defunding the police, that's really interesting. I didn't know that was a big part of what he did there. But it makes sense, because people do have to realize that there will always be some kind of power structure. Because that is just how things have always been in society. And so you can have these utopian ideas of like, oh, no police, because, granted, having a police force will have a certain amount of abuse. I see it all the time, like police just turning on their flashers and running a red light because they're police officers. And then, of course, much worse things than that. So you have that abuse. But what you have to realize is that when you abolish that and get rid of it, you're not going to have some kind of utopian society. You're going to have something else filling that void. It's just the same thing like with mafias, right? Like when the mob boss dies, and then there's a power vacuum there's going to be a certain period of chaos until the next strong man comes and claims his territory. And that's the same thing with I feel like we're covering all the bases right now. We're the same thing with taking people's weapons away, like with Beto O'Rourke, who's running for governor in Texas now.
He's going for the trifecta. He's trying to lose for Senate, a mayor, right? Mayor, Senate, and governor. Going for the trifecta, or no?
Well, he did run for president.
Okay.
And he didn't make it very far. Mayor of the United States.
He's trying to lose a presidential race, a Senate race, and a governorship. Go ahead.
But yeah, like he was very like passionate about like, yeah, we're gonna take your AR-15s, we're gonna take all these things, and like weapons are dangerous and they hurt people. But I think it's important for citizens to have that, because if you don't have the ability to defend yourself and defend your family, then like, especially as men, then like what are you? Like you can't be entirely dependent on other people for everything. And that's what Marxism, and that's what I think Lenin was doing to Russia, and making them dependent on the government for everything, so that they had no choice but to buy into this kind of oppressive regime.
Yeah. It makes me think of Batman Begins, that Chris Nolan film, because he, remember how Liam Neeson says, your parents' death was not your fault. It was your father's. And Batman goes, I was trained. Man had a gun. And Liam Neeson says, would that have stopped you? And he says, I've been trained. Well, that's, it was that exchange, well, you're right, because my response to that, if I had been Liam Neeson, I would have said, well, he shouldn't have taken you out a dark alley in the middle of the night.
First off.
It doesn't sound as cool when it's me saying it and not Liam freaking Neeson. But the idea is that, you need to be able to protect your family. You should be able to have that, use your wits and use your hands and use whatever means at your disposal to be able to protect your family. And obviously terrible things happen to families every day. And that's not the fault of whoever is in charge of protecting those families. No, I'm not saying that at all. But I get your sentiment is, well, we need to be able to to at least have a fighting chance. We need to set ourselves up to have a fighting chance to protect our family. And also, I would say too, just in case there's any police officers that might be watching our show, I think what they would say is probably with the sirens running a red light is that, well, there's some sort of emergency where they can't turn on their sirens the whole time. There's like minor emergencies that they have to run to, and that's them running their light for the minor emergency. However, I think that your point is taken, is that there are abuses in power that we see on a daily basis. Like there are real abuses that happen. And that is a problem with any type of person or any type of group that has power over others. The fact that more abuses don't happen on a daily basis is a good thing. Like it really says quite a lot about them. And the Bolsheviks, the Bolshevik Revolution is a perfect example of the plethora of ways where more abuses of power can happen, and is a warning to us, showing that we don't want that type of abuse of power. We don't want millions of people dying of starvation. That is, we want to try to avoid that, guys. So let's try not to do what these people did, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's I think kind of it's just realizing that all systems, all human systems, like it's you just kind of have to be realistic, right? All human systems do have a certain amount of abuse, and making hoping that someday we can achieve this kind of utopian idea where the central government has all things and distributes all things equitably and fairly to everyone. Like we can hope for that, but like you have to be grounded in reality as well, in that if the more power you give something, the greater the opportunity for abuse. And obviously you see that in Russia, because then for how long, like 50, 60 years, 70 years, how long did like the communist regime last there in Russia?
1991.
Where they just mowed down their own people for that for decades and decades.
Yeah.
And millions died. So it's just really like a utopia sounds nice in theory, but in practice, it is horrific.
Yeah. Well, we're running short of time. Agreed that it's horrific. Do we have final thoughts here before as we wrap up?
Well, something that I'm wondering though, like as filmmakers, then do we see any of these ideas expressed in film? And what kind of what do we have any directors in mind, or any films that we can point towards to see like, yeah, these ideas are expressed in this way, and this at least on some kind of philosophical basis? Like what kind of films are we looking at today?
Yeah. Well, Bolshevism, Marxism in film is a common occurrence. I'm just trying to think about, let's get more specific. I always admire directors that are able to hold up their own philosophy on life against itself. Like there's not a contradiction in terms. Like you say one thing about life, you make an observation, and it carries through as a through line that holds up within a story world. Someone who's an example of that we already talked about, Chris Nolan, does a really good job of that. He's able to say, well, Joker bad. Well, Joker is a great example of Darwinism, where he's kind of a Nietzschean figure. Where Nietzsche says, what doesn't kill me makes me stronger, and Joker says, what doesn't kill me makes me stranger. He is the Nietzschean Obermensch that walks the earth among us and creates chaos. And Chris Nolan is able to pick that apart and say, look, this is dangerous, guys. This sort of Darwinistic idea leads to chaos. And he's able to bring that quite effectively to the forefront with his sort of Tale of Two Cities episode, or not episode, movie, but The Dark Knight Rises. And he shows how someone can overcome that. And I really admire how he's able to take these ideas and spin them into a story, at least how he did in that time. I haven't seen his latest one, so I don't know if he's continuing to play with that, to play with these kind of larger ideas. Someone who actually I don't admire very much anymore. I mean, he had some great films to begin with, but he is an example of someone who doesn't have the ability to consistently think through his films. Would be someone like Scorsese, who always seems to be consistently contradicting himself. It's almost like he's in love with the sound of his own voice with his 3-hour-long movies. We tried to watch Casino recently, and we couldn't get through it because it was just incredibly boring. It reminded me a lot of The Wolf of Wall Street. I kept on wishing it in The Wolf of Wall Street as I was sitting there in the theater that I was watching it on Netflix instead, and then I could just go, whoop, can I just go to the end? I get it at this point. He did the same thing, like to be more specific, he did something very similar in Silence, where he says, let me make a story about a very proud person, a very proud, vain person who goes to get martyred. And that's the missionary spirit, is pride and vanity.
Silence, that's the one with Andrew Garfield, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Where he plays the Jesuit that goes to get killed, to get martyred by the Japanese, I think it was.
Yeah.
And it's, or it was the Chinese. Anyway, he goes to Asia gets martyred. But he doesn't, he capitulates and he becomes, he renounces God, and that's the end. And he has his little cross hidden underneath. But that is kind of the idea, that is a contradiction. He's constantly contradicting himself, because he's like, at my heart, I want to have God, but at the same time, on the outward sign, I want to have no God. Like this will work, this sort of contradiction. No, it doesn't work that way. If your outward signs are that you have no God, that you disbelieve in God, then inwardly, your inward self will be the same. That doesn't exist, at least in reality. If I was to say to God, no, I don't love you, I don't, through my actions, in my interior self, I still say to God, no, I don't love you. I don't contradict myself in this. I don't exist in these two dualities where there's spirit and then there's body. Now, it doesn't mean that I'm constantly in my actions saying that I love God, because I'm saying on the inside that I love God. I'm saying there's sometimes I fall, but I don't exist in both planes at the same time, if that makes any sense. His whole idea that man can exist on the same planes at the same time, on two different levels on the same time, falls apart on itself. It doesn't have any existence.
It's just, incomprehensible.
Right. It doesn't have any basis in reality. And Scorsese has that in all his films, really. There's really not much basis in reality anymore. At one point, when you're talking about like Raging Bull or Taxi Driver or not Taxi Driver or whatever, you know what I mean, his classic films, there was a pretty consistent through line, and they're very exciting. But we seem to have lost that. And you see directors a lot of the time that are losing their kind of touch of reality. I would say watch out for that. Someone who does a really good job of kind of struggling with grand ideas is Terence Malik. He's able to kind of speak on this sort of high level, this sort of like grand abstract theories, and still have some sort of grounding in reality most of the time.
And so what are some of the things that he's done?
So we talked about A Hidden Life recently. That's really good. I also loved the one that was shot all on Golden Hour. I forget what that one's called now, but that's a famous one. He did that one with Christian Bale recently. Gosh, I'm blanking all the names. We can look them up later, and we can post some Malik movies.
Yeah. I think that it comes back to like what you were talking about with your friend, like in Spain, like he wants to go work the land. I don't think that's necessary, but it is good symbology right there that that you have to, in order to really maintain your own sanity in many ways, you do have to stay grounded in something, right? And work, of course, is a very good thing to stay grounded. And like me personally, I also really enjoy like working on land, like in nature, like, cultivating plants and like gardens. Like that's why I like think garden is a very good like therapeutic thing for people. But I think that you're saying, like with these directors just losing touch with reality, because obviously like they're very successful and they're there and surrounded by that Hollywood world. And I think the Hollywood world is almost more removed than like any other world in society today. That's completely disconnected from the people they purport to represent, right? Because they're making movies that are meant for, you know, the society in general, to express, you know, the struggles and the stories of people, but they have no idea anymore like who they're portraying, like who the people really are that they're actually trying to tell stories about.
Yeah, I think the parting thought I would say is that what my old spiritual director, who actually, a great coup, guys, come back next week because we're going to have my old spiritual director from Los Angeles as a guest. And one of the things he said to me when all of this really started to go crazy was focus on your own land. And of course, I didn't have land at the time. I lived in Los Angeles in an apartment. And what he meant by that, though, was there's things that you in your own life can control. Focus on that. Focus on your own, like how can you clean up your room, as Jordan Peterson would say, and fix that. Fix your own self. Fix what you can within your own sphere of influence. You know, fix your relationship with your spouse and your parents and all those type of things. And that is working your own land. That is tilling the soil of your own life. Mm-hmm. And from there, let's work on fixing everything else.
Mm-hmm. That's a really great note to end this on. That's very beautiful. Just, you know, focusing on the beam in your eye rather than your brother's eye.
Yeah.
And that's something that we always forget, but it's not only good for society, but extremely good for your own mental health.
Yeah.
Because you can do a lot to improve yourself.
Yeah.
You can despair, oh, I can't improve society, but like what you're saying, it starts with improving yourself and focusing on how you can improve those relationships in your own, like tilling your own soil, your own land. It's great. Mm-hmm.
Well, thanks, Father Paul. I guess, Pete, why don't we leave it here for now? Everyone, thank you so much for joining us here on the Pinedo Brothers Podcast. We are the Pinedo Brothers, working to revitalize the world of Catholic art through film. We hope you've enjoyed it. Pete, thanks so much for chatting.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Pinedo Brothers Podcast, an artist podcast for Catholics. We hope you enjoyed it, and if so, please consider subscribing, and commenting below. That really helps. This episode was edited and recorded by me, JP. Makeup was done by no one, if you couldn't tell. The Pinedo Brothers are Catholic filmmaking brothers working to revitalize the world of Catholic art through film. For more information on us, check us out at pinedobrothers.com. Thanks again.